now on screen.
Hello.
So look, the first thing I want to say is thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I didn't say before when I was doing an introduction to this how old you were, and I don't know whether you want me to say that, but I think it's really quite remarkable that someone who has reached his 90s is still so productive and working in the profession. Yes. And still making a contribution when many of us have probably hung up our boots and are thinking more about what we're going to have for dinner. But anyway, Godfrey's agreed to do this for us, and I'm going to take you through in this interview. I'll take you through much of your life, I suppose. So the first thing I wanted to ask you was something about your family background and the context. And you grew up in Western Australia. That
yes,
part is true,
right.
isn't it?
Yes.
And where did you go to school, or what was your secondary schooling and all of that like?
All right. Well, you mentioned my age. I am in fact 98. And
okay,
so it surprises me that I'm still going. And I went to school. I did my primary schooling by correspondence at my country home at the time, and went on to high school in Northern, and from there on to the University of WA initially.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so your initial tertiary qualification then was from UWA.
Yes, that's right.
And I presume, what was that, a Bachelor of Arts or something, or did?
Well, I tried hard to do the things that I was most interested in, but yes. I couldn't at all times because they just didn't have the breadth of program and interest. Yes. But I did meet a colleague who was a young faculty member there, whose name some people would recognise. Pat Pentany was the man I'm thinking of.
Right. Yes.
And he encouraged me toward Rogers. He was very interested in Rogers' work, but I couldn't focus on it at UWA to any extent. I wound up doing a thesis that my supervisor had a grant that provided for on work satisfaction, and which was interesting to a point. I certainly learned quite a bit about research that's been done in work and job satisfaction.
Yes.
But gradually I was able to move toward what I hoped to do, to work with Carl Rogers.
Right.
And at some point, about that time, I was, well on the way through this thesis research. I wrote to him directly, and he actually replied straight away.
Have you still got the letter?
I probably still have that letter. Yes, I think I do. It's mentioned in one of my books.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yeah. The one on Carl Rogers' helping system. And so I was very impressed and encouraged by that he bothered to write back to me right away, an unknown student in this faraway spot. And so at any rate, I was further encouraged, and gradually it became more possible for me to actually get to Chicago. And I had some help from family, and one of my brothers especially was very helpful toward me.
Right.
Being able to do that.
So in other words,
my father owed him money for a farm he'd taken on, and he sent that money. He gave that money, passed on that money to me.
Oh, and right. Yes.
So by that time I was married. We had a little son, and the three of us embarked by ship for Chicago.
Right.
That was quite an adventure at that time.
So we're really talking about. I did read somewhere that you married in 1946.
With what?
You married in 1946.
Yes, that's right.
So we're really talking about the late 40s.
No, we're talking about the beginning 50s,
Okay,
actually.
yes, yes.
We had our little boy after we'd been married for some time,
Yes.
5 years.
Yes.
And he just turned 1 at the time we left for Chicago.
All right. That at the time must have been a very considerable adventure that you were undertaking.
Yes, it really was. Yeah. We went on an old steamer on its last voyage as far as England is concerned, and then on a French ship which was commandeered after the war for the rest of the trip.
All right, yeah. So I get the idea that Rogers was very encouraging of you, which must have been very nice of you to know that this man was interested in you and wanted was happy for you to come over and study and so on.
Yes.
But just going back a step, where did you get the interest in psychology anyway, and in the helping professions?
Well, I started my academic studies in physics and chemistry because I had done very well in those subjects at school, and I was already pretty conversant with those fields, and I hadn't heard of psychology at all at the time I went to university, and
that would be right.
It wouldn't be the case later on. My students would know about psych in high school, and I was very interested. I became interested straight away, and I was feeling my way in life. I was a somewhat anxious young man, and I think psychology really appealed to me, partly because I was in that state of mind myself.
Right.
And so once I heard about it and knew about it, I needed to finish my science degree first of all, though. I needed to be able to get a job and so forth afterwards. And then I switched over to psychology and did a degree in arts in psych.
Right, yeah.
And
yes, you're really talking about the very beginning of psychology in this country.
Yes, it was fairly early days.
Yeah.
And
I think Western Australia was a bit of a leader actually in this area. And I think the first psych department was in Sydney, and then there was one in Melbourne, and there was one here in WA.
Yes, that's
They're the ones I seem to have remembered from some of my reading. Yes.
And Tim Marshall was head of the psychology in WA.
Right.
And he was personally encouraging.
Yes.
I got to know him very well. He visited us in Chicago later. And so that although I wasn't studying with him for my degree, that was a background that was very helpful. Mm-hmm.
And he became president of the APS.
I think
in his early years.
Yes. And anyway, he was.
And he was encouraging you to.
He was an encouraging person. Yes.
Yeah. Well, when you got to Chicago, I guess you must have felt a little sort of out of your area or out of your comfort zone a bit, because here you are, a young Australian man with a wife and a child.
Yes.
Being thrust into graduate study in North America, and there wouldn't have been many other Australian students doing this sort of work, I suppose.
No, there weren't many at that time, even in Chicago, which was outstanding at the time. It was on the radar of people, academic people who were interested in new, innovative work.
Yes.
And Chicago at that time was not a difficult place for us to be in, particularly as we had accommodation on the campus of the university.
Yes.
The university was modelled a bit after Oxford and Cambridge in its buildings and appearance, and it was quite a congenial place to be. Actually, I wouldn't venture on that sort of thing in the United States nowadays, but in those days, I found it a very encouraging and broadening situation to be in. The whole experience, not only the university. Yes.
It's I think it's always had a very good reputation, Chicago. I mean, I don't think it gets counted in the Ivy League group, but it might be just outside that group.
Well, it's I thought of, although I don't know whether I would have got in, but I thought of Harvard because it's so well known.
Yes.
But actually, I think I made a better choice.
Yes.
A considerably better choice for me.
Well, if you'd gone to Harvard, you wouldn't have found Carl Rogers, I suppose.
That's right. That's right.
So, given that you did find him, and he was obviously I assume he was very welcoming of you.
Yes.
How did your relationship with him build?
Well, as soon as I got there, I was able to start enrolling in preliminary courses. I had to pass the psychology department's general, I've forgotten what they called it, but there was a general comprehensive examination requirement to get a degree in psychology.
Right.
So that preoccupied me a bit in the first short period I was there. Anyway, I managed that in 2 stages, and getting through those exams, and by the time of the first new academic year, I was able to start working with Rogers and his group.
Right.
And he had a group of graduate students and junior faculty around him, and it was very much an embracing communication group.
Yes.
And so there was a lot of just interchange about ideas right from the very beginning.
Right.
And
so you are, I'm presuming you were the only Australian student there, and the others were probably...
I was.
There might have been a couple of Canadians maybe even, but mostly North American.
Yes, there was one Canadian student. No, wait a minute, where was he from? No, Norwegian student.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
There wasn't a Canadian student at the time.
Yeah.
And this Norwegian student and I got to know each other really well.
Right. Yes. So you enrolled in your PhD, and did you have a topic as such in those days, or did that emerge as you...
Well, I was very interested in Rogers' work on the necessary, and he wrote a paper you would have heard of called The Necessary and Sufficient Conditions of Therapy, which created quite a splash and a furor in some circles.
Right.
And I was very interested in trying to devise a way of testing whether the hypotheses that he presented really worked.
Yes.
Whether these can, so I had to measure these. I had to devise a way of measuring these conditions that he centered on, conditions of empathic understanding, what he called unconditional positive regard,
yes,
and others.
Congruence would have been one.
Yes, and a couple of other conditions that were very important. And I managed to design an instrument. A lot of work had been done with another approach altogether of setting things out in statements in an array, and organizing that array of statements into the ones that were most like or most relevant or least relevant.
Is that a bit like the old Q sort, is it?
Yes, it was the Q-sort technique. That's right.
Yeah.
Stevenson was in Chicago. He was on the faculty in Chicago.
Oh, okay.
The developer of that approach.
Yeah.
And but after a while, I realized it was very difficult to actually measure systematically discrete factors through that method.
Yeah.
And so I chose a questionnaire method instead.
Yes.
And which involved developing what I call the relationship inventory.
Yes.
And that worked out reasonably well.
Well, at what stage then was that was your PhD topic, was it?
Yes,
to
that's
develop
right.
the inventory. And so,
yes,
given that you got a PhD, you must have that must have been a successful outcome. The inventory, in other words, stood up.
Well, the inventory was crucial to the study.
Yes.
Obviously, it was central to the study.
Yes.
But the study was centered on measuring these conditions and testing whether they seemed to really be crucial for the outcomes of therapy.
Yes.
So I finally managed to get onto another big research topic as well, where I drew many of the clients, because they had to be live clients and therapists working with those clients.
Yes.
And I managed to amass a group of about 40 clients and their 15 or so therapists.
Right,
20
okay.
therapists, and who all laboriously answered this relationship inventory,
Right.
which ran to about, at that stage, about 90 items. And the items were not yes/no things, but they were on a scale.
Right.
And so that was quite an interesting experience, getting all that data to start with.
So you were presumably connecting the therapists with their clients in some way to look at the relationship between the two.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, there are studies that are still being done that using that kind of structure, I think.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. So there was no sort of development of or use of devised situations. They were the clients in actual therapy.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and they were all responding to this relationship inventory, both the clients and the therapists.
I can't let this pass without asking you. Did you have anything to do with Rogers at the time he made that short film, The Three Approaches to Psychotherapy? And the three therapists
Yes, I know.
interviewed Gloria.
I know the film.
Yeah.
He made that film a bit later on, quite a bit later on.
Right.
Or his part in it.
Yes.
In fact, well, we'll come to that if you want to, but he did visit here in Australia.
Yes.
He brought the first copy of that film with him.
Well, tell me about that. I mean, that's probably something that not many of us know, of course.
Well, we got to know each other well in the course of my studies, and we kept in touch by letter a lot as well.
Yes.
And when I settled in Australia for a time after Chicago, I was at the University of New England at the time.
Yes.
And Rogers wrote to me one day, and he said, "My wife and I are thinking of taking off on a voyage across the ocean and calling in Australia. Would you like me to visit?"
Oh.
So I said, "Yes, indeed, I would be glad for you to visit." And so that's what he did. And I'd been running the workshops with people interested in therapy from across Australia, and established one of those for him to conduct
Right. Oh, that would have been oversubscribed, I suspect.
Yes, that's right. I had to select people more by invitation than
Yes.
than anything else, because there would have been too much interest altogether.
Yes.
But he did give a big lecture afterwards in the University of New South Wales,
Right.
which was attended by a very large audience, and gave talks elsewhere as well.
So, what time of the century are we up to now, when this is all happening?
Well, this is a good bit later.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to think of when it would be exactly. It's 1950. No, it's in the 1960s. It would have been, I think.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And I mean, still a long time ago.
Yes.
But
because I know that the University of New England developed it probably began around the time you're speaking. Interest in counselling psychology, and although there weren't courses as such, I don't believe so.
I don't think there was a lot of interest in counselling, except to some extent through my work.
Yes.
At that time, I didn't have an official university counsellor, but one of the people who took part in one of the workshops eventually became the university counsellor there, formally.
Yes.
And
so really, I'm talking to someone who is the, if not the driving force, a driving force in getting counselling psychology some sort of professional recognition in this country.
I suppose I did help it. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know that in my early experience, I did know that there was an interest in counselling psychology in New England, but I'm really talking about possibly the 70s rather than the 60s.
Yes,
and I think it's faded out a little bit now, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. But I'm not up to date.
No, well, I think it's a bit of a pity, really, but we might get to some of that. That's another issue I'd like to tackle a bit later.
Right.
But it is interesting to know that Rogers came to visit you and and help spread the word.
Yes, that's right. Further spread the word. Yes.
Yeah. So you talked about your relationship inventory, that was part of what you developed.
Yes.
When you were early in your career, but it's gone on to get international recognition. So
yes, that's right.
That's so it's been an important psychometric development, I suppose, in the area of relationships. So what was your thinking in terms of broadening it away from just therapists and
well, I was interested
clients
in its application in family relations, in couple relationships to begin with.
Yes.
And then to some extent in family relationships more broadly, or involving other members of the family.
Mm-hmm.
And I had students who were, as time developed, and I was overseas by this time again, and who were interested in studying dynamics of relationship in other contexts, in addition to, or instead of therapy, but in terms of individuals, in many cases studying outside the therapy domain. For example, there were a lot of nurses who got interested, and there was provision in North America for graduate studies in nursing, and so there was a fairly advanced professional nurses who were involved in research as well.
Yes.
And so there were a lot of nurses, quite a lot of nurses took it up. Quite a lot of social workers got interested, as well as psychology students, psychology researchers. And I was bit surprised. I mean, altogether there would have been hundreds of studies that used the relationship inventory.
Yes, and so it goes on too, and I think one of your more recent publications was a kind of confirmatory study in China.
Yes, that's right.
Was it Taiwan or was it Taiwan?
No,
it was the mainland China, was it?
Well, it was both.
Both, okay.
But mainland China was, in a way, interesting. That there was there was a conference that I went to in Beijing, which actually attracted a lot of Chinese psychologists and counselors.
Yes.
And they were trying to get counselling really going there.
Yes, yes.
And believe it or not, there were eager young people there, the same as in other places, who were wanting to break through some boundaries.
Yes.
And get what they were interested in.
Yes.
Get to what they were interested in.
Yeah.
And, so I went to that conference, and it was very interesting.
Yes, I think well, my experience too of conferences where Chinese psychologists have been present, has been that they certainly have a different cultural approach to the work, and you would have found that too, I imagine.
I did, but I also found that they were very eager to know, to cross that cross that and cultural boundary, you might say.
Yes.
And learn what was particularly in the helping field.
Yes, yes. I suppose I was going to ask or make a comment about. I've had experience in Singapore.
Have you?
And
yes.
And counselling psychology there.
Yes.
This century, not last century, has taken off a bit, which is interesting.
Yes, it is.
Singapore, of course, being a city which, in a sense, it's partly Asian, but it's partly Western too.
Yes, that's right.
So the crossover is probably not quite so difficult, but anyway, it's crossing over. One of the questions I wanted to put to you was about I think I might have indicated to you earlier that there was the cultural and historical influence on Carl Rogers is something that you know about, I think, and for him to develop the sort of thinking that he did.
Yes, yes.
What do you think it was? What was he? Was he rebelling against something, or what?
No.
Can you tell me what it was? What do you think was motivating him?
No, it was the war. It was the World War II, I guess it was, one or two.
Yeah.
And he in wartime, not only was there need for psychology of a practical kind, to some extent in the armed forces, but there were floods of veterans coming back before long.
Okay.
And needing to adjust again to civilian life after the horrors that they'd been through. And there was a demand for helping services, psychological counselling kind.
Yes.
And Rogers wrote a little known book, Counselling with Returned Servicemen. And he was drawn into that strongly himself, to contribute in that level. And so he himself believed that the war had actually contributed a lot to the development, to his therapy becoming well known. Yes. And a major influence in the field.
Right.
A major resource in the field.
Yes, yes.
That he attributed that partly to the war.
Yeah. I think I read somewhere where he also had, I don't know whether he had a personal connection with or met, FDR, Roosevelt.
Yes,
And now he was president, of course, during the war,
that's right.
but died before the end of it.
Yes.
And Harry Truman became the next president.
Well,
but he had such connection with Roosevelt.
Well, it wasn't a personal connection between Rogers and Roosevelt, but Roosevelt had I can't think of his name offhand. He had a right-hand person. The presidents are surrounded
yes.
by other people.
They are. Yes.
And this was a very influential right-hand man for Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And he learned about Rogers, and he was leaning towards the importance of a facilitating kind of resource for people during and after the war. The notion of facilitation rather than something that was fully structured and something that would be prescribed in the usual sense of that word. And I don't know if he had personal contact with Rogers, but Rogers spoke of him in some of his writing as being a person who was somehow of a similar spirit to himself.
Well, that's unusual in a way, and in that, and perhaps fortuitous. I mean, given the number of people that presidents surround themselves with, to have somebody like that who was able to influence the president, I suppose, and to push this alternative way.
Well, I became very interested in Roosevelt myself, in terms of his attitudes and outlook.
Yes.
And I saw quite a lot of parallel with Rogers, and I, in some respect, and I bring that out in one of my books, on the Carl Rogers helping system.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, without going into the full detail of it, but what connections did you find? What similarities did you think were there?
Roosevelt had a very interesting he had a social worker in his cabinet, a former social worker in his cabinet, whose name escapes me just at the moment. Yeah. And she was quite an influence, among others, on him. And I think that he personally was drawn to try to bring the best out of people. His style was not so much instructional as facilitating.
Right.
He wanted to bring other people out in terms of their special abilities and resources, regardless of who it was. And of course, presidents surrounded with a lot of people. And he was fairly unique in that respect, I think, among modern presidents. And so I got very, and I did see some parallels with Rogers in his basic attitude.
Well, both men would want to bring the best out and see the good and see the competence in people, and to make use of it or to develop it.
Yes.
That's interesting, because Roosevelt, I don't suppose we want to spend too much time on him, but we don't want to spend all our time on Roosevelt, but he was a president who was elected for 3 terms.
Yes, that's right.
And so he was a very successful leader.
Yes.
And with the attitudes you're describing, that perhaps underpins a lot of his leadership style. And perhaps if some of our more contemporary leaders were a bit more like that.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. No, I think that's interesting. So, well, I think I was asking initially there about the historical sort of influence on Rogers. I'm going to come to you in a minute because I'm going to ask you that question. But just before I do, was the other thing that was happening during the Second World War was the development of, I suppose, psychometric means or ways of identifying the skills in people.
Yes.
And for the army's purposes,
Sure.
and so they would be allocated to jobs that they could do.
Yes, yes.
And it was the development of career development in inventories that started
Yes.
then.
Yes.
And that's not quite Roger's interest, I suspect. Is that right? Or
Well, not so much on the testing side.
Yeah.
One side of that was really devising tests to
Yes.
really better tell what people are most suited for,
Yes.
and so forth.
Yes.
Rogers was less interested, I think, in the testing side of
Yes.
that work. But I'm not sure where to go with that. I'm a bit familiar with it, but I'm not very knowledgeable about it.
The other thing that was happening, of course, during some of Roger's earlier work too, and later too, of course, was the impact of other theoretical models.
Yes, that's right.
Skinner comes to mind immediately.
Sure. Yes.
So the whole behaviourist approach
Yes,
to things
yes,
was
yes.
something that other people believed was the way forward.
Yes.
Now he would have had to battle against that in a way, I suspect.
That's right. Well, fortunately, his work, Roger's work, was, came into being in demand so much, and was a leading new kind of therapy, that it wasn't too much of an uphill battle. But I was present, actually, for at least one and maybe two major debates between Rogers and Skinner.
Oh, right. I think we need to hear about this.
And they were both very articulate and
Yes.
very resourceful in debate.
Yes.
Skinner was a bright guy,
Yes.
and he was capable of thinking outside the square that he made for himself.
Oh, right. Yes.
And so they were well matched in a sense.
Right.
And they had some very interesting debates, but and it wasn't so much to win the debate as to exchange views.
Yes.
That were influential. And but it was interesting to see them sparring off against each other.
Yes, I'm sure it was. It's interesting you say Skinner was a very bright bloke. I only know him through his writing and so on, and the bit that we were all taught in our training programs and things.
Yes.
But he did write. He wrote Walden too as a book.
Oh yes,
didn't he?
that's right. I was thinking of that also.
Yes.
Yes, he wasn't bound by the approach to the behavior therapy approach that he
Yes.
was helping to develop,
Yes.
or did develop.
Yes.
So it was an interesting personality.
Yes.
He was an interesting
Yes.
personality.
Yeah. So, as these two different therapeutic approaches go on and develop, we're still in a situation, I suspect, where there's some divisiveness almost between the two, or some conflict that we have people who are, if I'm going to say that counselling psychology emerges out of the Rogers tradition,
Yes.
clinical psychology in many ways has in the past anyway emerged out of the Skinnerian approach.
I agree,
and with cognitive behaviour therapy,
Yes.
which seems to be what many clinical psychologists do first before they think of anything else.
Yes, that's right.
I think that's changing a bit.
I think it has.
But there's this battle going on.
Yes. No, well, when therapists are trying to help real people in trouble, their outlook does tend to broaden, I think, regardless of their formal orientation.
Yes.
And they have to be able to be effective in some way with the people that come to them.
Yes.
And so that, and furthermore, in Australia, though, cognitive behaviour therapy has been, or was for a time at any rate, more exclusively prominent than any other methodology.
Yes.
And in a way that wasn't true in North America, because always the American Psychological Association was a much broader range, had a much broader range of interest than the Australian counterpart.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's interesting what happened here.
Changing a bit.
I think it has.
But there's this battle going on.
Yes. No, well, when therapists are trying to help real people in trouble, their outlook does tend to broaden, I think, regardless of their formal orientation.
Yes.
And they have to be able to be effective in some way with the people that come to them.
Yes.
And so that, and furthermore, in Australia, though, cognitive behaviour therapy has been, or was for a time at any rate, more exclusively prominent than any other methodology.
Yes.
And in a way that wasn't true in North America, because always the American Psychological Association was a much broader range, had a much broader range of interest than the Australian counterpart.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's interesting what happened here, but it's necessarily both. Any approach, I think, gets more pluralistic over time.
Yes.
And so that people who might have had a more sort of standard approach originally have to broaden their horizons and their work. And it happens naturally, I think, so that I don't put people who consider themselves cognitive behavioral in basic approach in as narrow a box.
Right. So we're not discarding all their knowledge.
As was originally tended to be the case. So there are resourceful people, and that.
Yes. So following along from that thought, in what way do you think counselling psychology has modified its approach or developed?
Well, Rogers began, and I have tapes of his still, of his therapy, made in the days when I was in Chicago, and soon after, was very much emphasizing in those early days all the time this reflection of the client's meaning as he understood it.
Yes.
And he was always inviting the person to go further or clarify or put him right if he wasn't quite right.
Yeah.
So it was very much a reflective methodology. In fact, he didn't introduce ideas of his own or impressions of his own that he might have had or would have had later on in his life into therapy at that stage. He was extremely resourceful in bringing out the client's meaning as far as possible, and the feelings, of course, associated with that meaning, and without deviating from that at first.
Yes.
But later on in his own work, he became he would introduce impressions of his own that he was starting to get. It was always in a responsive style and always open to correction. But he definitely, and it was partly through group work that he became broader in his repertoire.
Yes, okay, yes.
Through facilitation of group process.
Yes.
And but he and I got seriously interested in what were first called encounter groups about the same time.
Yes.
And I in Australia for what I was doing.
Yes.
And Rogers about the same time. Then at the University of Wisconsin, got seriously interested in groups.
So where were you at this stage? You were back here now.
I was back here. I was in Armidale, New South Wales,
in New England,
conducting my workshops.
Right. Okay.
With people who came in from various parts of the country, and Rogers was in Wisconsin, working with psychiatry students as well as psychology students, and doing therapy for the first time with people who were hospitalized schizophrenic in their diagnosis.
Yes.
Which was a big challenge indeed for a person of Rogers' orientation.
Yes. It's interesting that you've just triggered a little memory for me, but there was a film made by an English film director. I'll think of his name in a minute. It was about something about the family, and it was about. It was made in about 1970, and it portrayed the introduction of group work into this I suspect psychiatric ward.
Yes.
And an attempt to use the encounter group methods.
Yes.
I don't know whether this film rings any bells with you, but that was what was going on. And the end of the film, it was meant to be a film that criticised the traditional clinical white coat approach to everything.
Yes.
Because in the end of the film, the new encounter group movement gets discarded, not funded anymore, and we go back to white coats. And
I see. Yes.
I'll think of that film in a minute. But anyway, but it was an interesting that the encounter group movement, I remember, started, or it got to be carried out in quite a lot of different places in the late 60s, 70s.
Yes. Well, actually, even in Australia, there was one place that was essentially a psychiatric institution in Sydney, where the person in charge came to one of the workshops that I conducted, and he was attempted to introduce this kind of approach to working with patients throughout, and his name was Stubley, John Stubley, I think it was, and he eventually moved away from Sydney, but he was there for quite a while, and his own life went into a bit of a downward spiral at a much later stage. But he, so there were some inroads at that. He was working in an institution where he wanted there to be groups of patients who were involved in a facilitative process.
Yes. And, Now, I mean, the general theme I think we're talking about here is how new things emerge out of what's gone before, I suppose. And sometimes it's a minor change or a shift, but sometimes it's quite major. And I'm reminded that the history of family therapy as a model, which I'm familiar with, really emerged out of psychiatry in the United States, where the psychiatrists were finding that their work was being undone because the patients would go home to from the work with the therapist. They'd go home and all the work would be undone the minute they walked back into their old environment. And so the psychiatrists came to believe that they needed to work with the family. And so that whole family therapy thing emerged. I don't know whether has that does that ring any bells with you? Is there anything?
Yes, I know about that movement, and I think I met one. Yes, I did meet one. I was involved for a time in what was called the American Academy of Psychotherapy. It had a grand name, American Academy of Psychotherapists, or something like that.
Yes.
Mostly people who were not orthodox in their approaches.
Yes.
And there were some interesting people involved in that organization,
Yeah.
including some of those early family therapy people who were trying to get another sort of emphasis going, which took in a much more systemic approach.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
And so I am a bit familiar with that anyway.
Yes.
And in my own later work on relationships, well, maybe you'll come to that.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, of course. So, because well, let's follow along with that. That I know that you briefly, before we started all this, you mentioned we were talking briefly about relationships and your interests. So, where did that come from? How did that?
Well, I just
develop?
I just my interests. I'm a curious person, and my interests in relationship got broader than therapy, into couple relationships and families and teacher-student relationships and other contexts. And I eventually, much later, produced the book on relationships, and I'm just interested in relationship over a very broad range. I'm interested not only in personal and family relationships, relationships in education, in organizations, even animal-human relationships, and relationships in war and genocide was something that I searched into because of that awful situation that had been going on in Rwanda.
Yes.
And after that, I wondered even why World War I led on to, and in many ways laid the ground for World War II.
Yeah.
There was no real resolution of issues from World War I, and the outcome of World War II in terms of the approach to healing was completely different than it had been in World War I, which was mainly about punishment and reparations and that sort of thing. Yes. So at any rate, relationships in a much broader sense than we usually at first think about them are of much broader interest to me.
Yes. And it sounds like you're really saying that the significance of a relationship, or the way in which relationships emerge and establish themselves, is core to so much of what happens in our lives. That it's not just who we marry or who we make as friends, or how we relate to our clients as therapists, but it's also this broader sense of, well, you're talking about work situations and even, well, you mentioned what happens to bring about, I suppose, the resolution of larger conflicts.
That's right. I agree, and it's a to me it involves a different approach to psychology in a way, a fundamentally different. And we've been reared. I think we were being reared for a long time in a psychology of the individual. What occurred was that individuals, or what the thinking was, that individuals were largely freestanding beings, and they of course had a lot to do with each other, but largely to satisfy individual needs. And it wasn't until later that relationships were seen as having a life of their own, as developing a life of their own, and as implying, this to me is certainly the case, that humans are fundamentally relational beings, and we evolve our personalities, the more individual features, out of relationships that we've experienced, and we continue to be creatures of relationship, as I see it. And you and I are in this conversation now, and it's a relationship. It's a manifestation of relationship that's in play.
Yes.
And so that I have a different view, I guess, of human nature than I had initially, in thinking of us as fundamentally relational beings.
Yes.
And
well, it's sort of it reminds me of that old adage that it takes a village to raise a child. So that that's the kind of beginning of some of this. That that as children we are of course raised by our parents, but we have relationships with many other people too.
Yes,
and
that's
more
right.
and more people as we get older.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And we have relationships in these diverse contexts we've touched on.
Yes.
Of groups of various kinds. For many people, not so much now, but earlier on, they were church-related or groups that so many people were involved in.
Yes.
And of course, we work in organisation. Most people nowadays work in an organisation of some kind.
Yes.
And so the relationships do. I'm repeating myself. Excuse me.
But it's probably worth repeating, Godfrey. I think it's so important.
Permeate our lives. Yes, and our lives. I say our lives as I see it, are lives of relationship, essentially.
Yes.
And so it's. For me, at any rate, it's quite a shift in thinking.
Yes, but I think you're also saying, I suppose. Well, I think I might have said this too in other words, perhaps, but that it's almost like if anything positive is going to happen in the world, it's going to. If anything positive is going to happen in the world, it will be because there's been a development of successful and positive relationships between the people involved in whatever it is. Yes,
I think so. And unfortunately there are pressures on people, on so many people, that tend to box them in terms of the proper ways to, or effective ways to respond, what they imagine are effective ways to respond. That it tends to diverse us from this way of thinking about relationships as primary.
Yes.
And I mean, if I've recently put together a series of essays that I called Stirrings. They were based in talks that I gave over time, which are a lot to do with relationship, but they stray into different areas. And I would love to get them published, but I haven't found a way as yet. But there are so many contexts that were intrigued me as I went on with these series of talks I was giving.
Yes.
That my own view widened.
Right.
And,
I think it's quite inspiring in a way, Godfrey, to hear you say something like that, because it means that even at 98 years of age,
Yes.
you're interested in finding or publishing new ideas. You're calling it stirrings. When you said that, I thought, oh yes, this is when we think of stirrings, we usually think of people sort of creating a bit of difficulty for someone and
Yes.
stirring them up and
Yes, that's
and
right.
challenging people anyway to think differently, perhaps. And
Yes.
maybe that's where some of what you're thinking's going.
Yes, I'm not quite sure why I chose the title Stirrings. I wanted something. I started out with something more complicated in the way of a title,
Yes,
and I gradually winnowed it down. And I think I'll just call it all Stirrings.
Well, we're all going to have to wait and see when this publication comes out. I'm sure we'll all be very interested.
Oh well, I'd be happy to share it in the meantime. It's in my computer.
What I'd like to say for the purposes of our audience is I just want to convey my gratitude to you for being here today, being able to spend time with me and to give so easily in many ways the times in your life when you've been at the forefront of great change, and certainly within the therapeutic world. And
Yes.
and I think those of us who see this video, I think will be greatly enhanced in terms of our experience and our understanding of things. So thank you very much indeed
You're
for
most
doing
welcome,
this.
Roger. And I've enjoyed our contact.